Good evening, everyone. Welcome to bi-monthly webinar that Faith-Based Caucus of Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network offers. Uh, Today, we are excited to talk about the topic that many people may not be aware of, that there have been 40-year-long collaboration between Christians in both North and South Koreas. Um, my name is Reverend Charles Ryu. I'm a United Methodist pastor now serving several churches in Manhattan, New York. And I'm one of the co-conveners with Doug Asbury of the Faith-Based Caucus of a KPN Grassroots Network. Today, we are very excited to have our fellow members of our caucus who has been working on Korea peace issues and given us a webinar before as well. I'd like to introduce Reverend Kurt Esslinger, who serves as a mission co-worker sent by the Peace USA, Presbyterian Church USA, to National Council of Churches of Korea, NCCK, based in Seoul. His primary work with NCCK is Reconciliation and Reunification Committee and also International Affairs. Through the NCCK, he was appointed as the coordinator for the Ecumenical Forum for Peace, Reunification, and Cooperation on the Korean Peninsula, EFK, Ecumenical Forum on Korea, which continued the Tozanso Process that began in 1984. Kurt, he helped found the Peace USA's Presbyterian Peace Network for Korea. He grew up in Texas, went to seminary in Chicago, McCormick Theological Seminary, and has been living in Korea for 11 years with his married partner, Hae-young, and their son, San. And he is now doing doctoral work with Trinity College in Dublin, working on Korea peace process. So we really have a good expert in our midst. I understand that he has a penchant for heavy metal music, even though I've never heard him play heavy metal music. And I understand he's trying very, very hard to perfect his bulgogi tacos. So with that, I'm going to invite Reverend Kurt Esslinger. He has 30 minutes to share his thought on what is known as Tozanso Process in our midst. Kurt?
Thanks, Charles. Thanks. And everyone, it's lovely to meet you. Good morning from Korea, in Seoul. I have my coffee ready to go. And just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I'm Kurt Esslinger. And so mission co-worker sent by Presbyterian Church USA. And it was in 2013 when I was sent to Korea and first started living here along with my wife, Hae-young. So this is what our family looked like at that time. My hair is a little bit longer. But at that time, we were sent as site coordinators for the Peace USA's Young Adult Volunteer Program. So we would bring U.S. young adults to live in Korea for 11 months of the year, and then we would connect them to volunteer placements around Korea, while also introducing them to the sort of culture, the context, and also the history of Korea, especially focusing on justice and peace. This one was a YAV group from a couple of years ago, and we also connected them to other international coworkers in the area. And some of you might recognize this is the Gwangju Memorial Cemetery for the victims of the Gwangju massacres from 1980. And then, so about a year and a half, it was about a year and a half into my life in Korea that one of my supervisors introduced me to the National Council of Churches in Korea, the NCCK, and gave me the chance to partner with their Reconciliation and Reunification Department. I had been telling people and my supervisor that I was interested in doing some kind of work on the conflict in Korea and thinking about reconciliation and things. And I also wanted to learn more about, especially the nature of the US's role in the ongoing conflict. So I had I had lived in Korea before studying exchange and had learned about things like Gwangju. So I thought, oh, okay, there's something a little bit curious about, the ways that the US supported massacres in Korea before. So like, what else might be going on in the conflict now? So I started becoming interested in that kind of like, how is the US involved in conflicts? When I was a YAV, a young adult volunteer myself, back in the day, I was living and volunteering in England. At the time, George W. Bush preemptively invaded Iraq in 2003. So for me, it was like that time I realized I can't just be, it's not enough for me to just be a good person out in the world. I needed to be actively figuring out, trying to address the problematic things that my country was doing around the world. So the NCCK gave me that chance here in Korea. And I began learning about the work that they have been doing for decades on the ecumenical movement for peace, reconciliation, and reunification in Korea. So through the NCCK, then I was introduced to the EFK, the Ecumenical Forum for Peace, Reunification, and Cooperation on the Korean Peninsula. And that's been working on the meetings between the North and South Korean Christian institutions since the 1980s. So then in 2018, that's when I stepped away from the YAV program, and I came to NCCK, and we moved to Seoul, and I was working with the NCCK for the full week. And then my wife became the Seoul site coordinator of the YAV program, the volunteers. And then the NCCK also that year had me appointed as the coordinator for the EFK. So I'm kind of like staff support for that forum now. And the EFK began, as Charles mentioned, the EFK began with the Tozanso process. So that's what I'll talk about this evening
Great.
for you.
Kurt, right before
Yes.
you go on, forgot to mention to the participants, as Kurt Esslinger, sorry, I called you Eislinger, Esslinger, uh, shares his presentation. If you have any questions, put it on the chat. Reverend Sugiro Song will glean them, and at the end, we'll have a Q&A time. Thank you. Kurt, back to you.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. I'll be happy to answer questions. So the Tozanso process refers to the series of meetings that began with a conference on peace in East Asia on the Korean Peninsula, at a meeting that met at the YMCA's Tozanso Center in Gotemba, Shizuoka, Japan in 1984. And that meeting came from work to develop communication between the NCCK and the Korean Christian Federation, which is a federation of Protestant Christians that's officially recognized by the North Korean government. So all these groups were hoping that the KCF could attend Tozanso, this meeting in Japan, but for some reason they were not able to go at that time in 1984. But the WCC, the World Council of Churches, hosted it, and it included ecumenical organizations and churches, like, for example, the German Church, who had been important partners to the NCCK in their work for human rights and democratization in South Korea. So the KCF couldn't attend, but they did send a message of support and saying they're praying that that meeting would go well. And so that was an important message to receive for the group. And that provided the foundation for the next the momentous meeting, which is the picture you see before you, that came 2 years later in Glion, Switzerland, which was another conference, but this one on peace and reconciliation in Korea. So the KCF, North Koreans, were able to attend this one, along with a number of other global church partners. That was a kind of tricky process that came about through the many contacts that were being made by the World Council of Churches, the WCC, and its members, including especially Koreans who were living abroad. See, at that time in the 1970s, leading up to this meeting, South Korea was still under US-supported dictatorship, and it still is illegal for South Koreans to have any kind of unapproved contact with North Koreans anywhere in the world. So they needed to go through other channels. So the dictatorship was only approving applications for contact from, for example, conservative Korean organizations at that time. So that first news in sort of Western Christianity that the Korean Christian Federation and was continuing its existence in North Korea, that came from sort of Koreans who had immigrated to other nations around the world, but were getting to working on projects and able to get back into North Korea to meet some of their families, and then also through the World Council of Churches, who had contact with Christian denominations in the Soviet bloc as the Cold War was going on. The WCC reached out to churches within the communist orbit. So also North Korean embassies in these countries, especially European countries, were helping to make that contact with the KCF, the Korean Christian Federation. That led to the WCC making a visit to North Korea in the late 70s, where the WCC was finally able to establish direct contact. Before then, most Christians in South Korea believed that the church in North Korea had been completely wiped out because they thought the communist government was completely opposed to all Christians and that can't have possibly survived. Especially that was according to U.S. intelligence and the South Korean dictatorship. But in the 70s, there was a growing distrust of all the lies that were told by all those who had a bias toward U.S. imperialism and that U.S. alliance, and especially U.S. Christendom. But then news of contacts with Christians in North Korea sort of changed that, sort of aroused suspicions. And then slowly, the more information came out, that like people looking back at the history, that North Korea was actually more of the hotbed of Christian activity. That at one time it was called Pyongyang was called the Jerusalem of the East. There was one big revival that happened even before the Korean War, under Japanese colonization, that happened in Pyongyang. What's curious about that revival, though, is one of the most important points that the missionaries who created it and the Korean Christians who were involved in it, their most important point was that they need to address the anger and the resentment that Koreans had toward Japan. That was more important than all the other sort of other things of Christianity and things. That was the first. So some of that revival, some of that strong Christianity was also in support of Japanese colonization. So there were a lot of I've heard Korean historians talk about, all Korean Christians opposed Japanese colonization. That's not exactly true. So when division did happen, there was a split between Christians as well. So there were a lot of Christians who either supported Japanese colonization or at least suggested we should be obedient to it and quiet and not say anything so as not to disturb the peace. And there were also Christians owning land, for example. And so those Christians in particular were not welcome in the new Korea that had been liberated from Japanese colonization. But there were Christians who did recognize that there were commandments for justice, that the injustice that Koreans had faced at the hands of Japan needed to be recognized. And for example, land should be given back to the full people. So some churches were willing to give up their land when liberation happened. And those Christians, for example, Reverend Kang Myang-uk, actually participated in creating the new North Korean government in the 40s. So there were Christians in the North Korean communist government, a part of all that nation building throughout this whole time. So all these pieces of information started coming out in South Korea for the first time in the 70s and 80s. But then also back into the 70s, there were consultations that the NCCK was having with the German church, where they were working on building solidarity to address the human rights violations of South Korea and the dictatorship there, and working on democratization. And so the German church said, you know what, you might not be able to reach democratization until you have a reunification. Just in the same way that Germany was working for reunification from its division, They said you also should probably work on reunification, and that came to become a kind of realization among the NCCK and progressive South Korean Christians, recognizing that until there is a reunification, there's not going to be actual democracy even in South Korea. And so that continues to hold in this day. And we see that in all the ways that when another pro-dictatorship conservative administration comes into power, that slides back. The democracy starts to slide away and it slides back toward dictatorship again. But so in that first meeting in Glion in 1986, as all those pieces were starting to come together and all those realizations turned into meetings for reconciliation, it was not without some tension. So there was distrust that still pervaded both the NCCK and the KCF, the North Koreans involved there. And on that first day of meetings, there were accusations slung at each other, like, yeah, you can't be real Christians because you worship Kim Il-sung, your great leader. But then the North Koreans, KCF, would also respond, like, you are not true Christians because you worship capitalism. You worship the U.S. imperial alliance. You ignore the commands of God for justice. So that story is, I've heard many times, is that tension held throughout the conversations until they had their first worship. And that worship was going on with normal prayers and then listening to the sermon, reading scripture. But something changed when they celebrated communion. So when they were celebrating the Eucharist, they were sharing the bread and wine, and then suddenly someone started crying. And then slowly more and more people were crying. And then suddenly everyone was crying and hugging. And so there was crying and hugging. There were these people who were sure that they were enemies against each other, but they were crying and hugging and embracing and shedding tears together. And that completely changed the atmosphere for the rest of the meetings and discussions. From that point on, they said, we can't keep doing it like this. We cannot keep just condemning each other. We might not fully trust each other, but we are going to learn to understand each other and recognize each other's differences, not as what makes us enemies, but as that's just a part of us being different human beings. And so they also agreed to work to share that transformation they had experienced with their communities back home. And there were two big things that sprouted out from those meetings. That one of them is they agreed to begin creating joint prayers that would reflect that hope for reconciliation and for reunification that came from that transformative experience. So it was not quite every single year, but almost every year they were crafting joint prayers together. With input both from the KCF in North Korea and from NCCK. And when I came on and they were making those prayers, what NCCK would usually do is write a draft prayer and then send it by email to their contacts in China, and then they would forward the email to the KCF in North Korea, because South Korea still blocks direct emails from a South Korean email address to a North Korean email address, so they still have to go through China. But eventually they would send edits back and forth. KCF would send a response and say, oh, we don't like this part of the prayer. We want you to put a little bit of this in the prayer and this. And so eventually they would come up with a final document, a joint prayer. And that was usually one for Easter and then one for August 15th, which is the anniversary of both of liberation from Japan, but also the beginning of division under US-Soviet competition. So every single one of those prayers was both a supplication to God to bring peace, but also a form of advocacy, encouraging Christians around the world to join their work for reconciliation and reunification on the Korean Peninsula. The other major creation that came out that was inspired by those meetings was a 1988 Declaration of the Korean Churches on National Reunification and Peace. This was a seminal document that laid out the Korean ecumenical approach to resolution of the conflict, to reconciliation, and to reunification on the peninsula. So the principles that were laid out in that 88 declaration, they were actually taken up and used by later President Kim Dae-jung's administration when they were having summit talks with North Korea in the early 2000s. For example, the June 15th, the 2001 summit. And whenever I've met Moon Chung-in and he's spoken at NCCK events, he will always talk about how when he was serving in Kim Dae-jung administration, he was one of the creators of the Sunshine Policy. He will talk about that it was the NCCK's 88 declaration that inspired them to use the NCCK's principles for reunification in their policies for the Sunshine Policy and in the agreements that they made with Kim Il-sung and the North Korean government. So those prayers and those statements, like the 88 Declaration, that the NCCK used that to inspire more advocacy to both the South Korean government and the US government and their allies in the UN to end the ongoing, constant hostile policy stance toward North Korea and to engage in dialogue and building of mutual trust instead. Sort of the way this worked for us. This is how we did it in our meetings. You can do it too. And when you're sitting at a table with North Koreans, it is possible. That's part of what it was saying. So these meetings also helped the WCC engage in advocacy with the North Korean government to help loosen some of the North Korean controls on the Christian community there. So they led the North Korean government to agree to opening up the ability for Christian communities to worship openly, for example. Before, they were only meeting in sort of house churches in secret. Now they could come out and be openly identify as Christians and openly and have worship and, for example, build churches. So this is one of the churches that came out from the North Korean government willing to change its policy on religion. This is Bongsu Church in Pyongyang. It's one of the churches that the NCCK often visits on their trips into North Korea, for example, this one in 2008. Let's see. The NCCK also continues these days to continue releasing statements. That they just released one statement on the increased tensions after South Korea flew drones into Pyongyang. We also had an international conference recognizing the 100th anniversary of the NCCK, and we wrote a communique and are sharing that around the globe. So those Tozanso Process meetings began to open up opportunities for all sorts of exchange projects, sharing of resources between the NCCK and the KCF. This was especially after the Kim Dae-jung government opened the way for inter-Korean civilian exchanges, and Kim Dae-jung government started approving all the applications for contact with North Korea and exchanges. So they set up projects like a bread factory. The NCCK helped to gather resources when there was a huge famine in the 1990s to make sure that North Korea had enough access to food and grain. So all these projects for cooperation help to create actual trust. It was all part of trust building measures as they had to work together and get to know each other as humans rather than as enemies. But then in the mid-2000s, the Korea watched George W. Bush administration and John Bolton hinder the Sunshine Policy. And then when I was in England, by the way, as we watched the Bush preemptively invade Iraq, and then Bush and Bolton said, yeah, and not only is Iraq part of the axis of evil, but so is North Korea, and implying, so we might do this to you as well. So then the KCF and the NCCK realized they needed to more effectively garner support from international partners. So the NCCK proposed an ecumenical consortium in 2006. This was also when the six-party talks were sort of meeting and then falling apart because the US kept moving the goalposts on North Korea. But then the KCF suggested instead that instead of a consortium, it should be a forum that would make it easier to expand participation to more and more international partners. So they were looking for more and more connections to partners in the outside. And that became, in 2008, when they met in Arnoldstein, Germany, that became the Ecumenical Forum for Peace, Reunification, and Development Cooperation on the Korean Peninsula at that time. Later, this more recently, as I became coordinator, the KCF suggested again that this focus on development is not so helpful, and especially the focus on Korea and the West giving aid to North Korea is not a helpful dynamic. It perpetuates that sort of giver and receiver dynamic. So now we're moving on, proposing to call it the just for peace, reunification, and cooperation on the Korean Peninsula. But we haven't yet met to have that officially chosen. But so that provided a space where projects, cooperation projects, humanitarian support, and humanitarian sharing, resource sharing could happen. It also provided a space to strategize advocacy to the UN and to the US government. So at the EFK, all these global partners with NCCK and KCF would come together and say, okay, what are we going to do in our next meeting when we travel to Washington, D.C.? Are we going to meet with the State Department? Are we going to be able to meet with the U.S. Congress? All of those kind of things. But all that was part of the sort of groundswell, the growing wave of transforming people's assumptions, especially transforming U.S. American assumptions about Christianity in North Korea, and dispelling these general myths about North Koreans, about North Korean leadership, and about North Korean life. So for me, I think it's important to note the meetings and the creation of this forum didn't mean that everything was all heart, stars, and rainbows between the KCF and the NCCK from then on. This is another meeting. This is kind of what the strategizing conversations look like. This was the EFK meeting in Geneva in 2018. They were still getting into arguments. I heard someone tell of one meeting when a representative from the Taiwan church began condemning the KCF for North Korean human rights violations. And the KCF delegation apparently stood up and walked out and completely left the forum. And so the NCCK and the WCC then had to spend the whole rest of the day going to the Taiwanese church delegation and then going to the KCF delegation and talking about we need to talk about this in a bigger context of human rights violations on the entire Korean Peninsula. Let's keep it in perspective and slowly trying to bring everyone back. And eventually those kind of things happen. My former supervisor also told me about arguments that he would get in with the KCF chairman. I won't go into details of those, but all that stuff was messy. Peace building is messy. You can't magically solve a conflict with joint statements or summit meetings. That takes many meetings, many statements, many conversations. But this is all a big part of what I got out of my work with the NCCK. So they made me the coordinator of the EFK at this meeting in Geneva. But I think what was most interesting for me was that sort of dispelling all of these myths of the assumptions that I had brought in from growing up in the US about what North Koreans are like and about what North Korean Christians must be like. And so this is me meeting the chair, Reverend Kang Myung-cho, and meeting him. And one thing I want to tell you about when I was first meeting the KCF, and even in Geneva, that I was sort of ready. I had been working on Korean. I had been living in Korea for 5 years at that point, and I had been using Korean in NCCK offices and things. And so I went up to the KCF and said in Korean, introduced myself. I'm really interested in meeting you, and I'm going to work really hard for the EFK. And Reverend Kang turned to one of our South Korean friends and said in Korean, "What on earth is this guy saying? I can't understand a word of it." And I was like, my heart just like dropped. I felt so bad. My NCCK friends were like, "Don't worry, it's when you haven't been meeting a lot of foreigners who are trying to speak Korean, you're not used to the accent. So we're used to your accent." I'm like, "Oh, right, I do have a really bad accent when I speak Korean, right? Okay, fine, fine." Um, but so it was important for me to have that experience to also kind of be knocked on my bum, and humbled, but then to really create these relationships that I tried to take back to U.S. churches. So when I would go to U.S. churches and tell them the work that I was doing when I gave mission reports, over and over they were like, "What? We didn't even know there was a Korean Christian Federation. We thought there were no Christians in Korea, or they're all only the secret ones." And like, or we heard those were fake Christians. They're just actors. They're not real. Like, apparently this is not a real pastor, but I've heard him preach. Like, I've prayed with him. We've cried in prayer meetings together. Like, good luck finding an actor who's that good, right? But so to me, that's one of the most important ministries that the EFK provides to the world, but especially as a U.S. American to the U.S. Unfortunately, since the Hanoi summit in 2019 and all the breakdown in negotiations between the Trump administration, and then the pandemic broke out 2020, the NCCK has had no communication with the KCF in North Korea. So the KCF has not been able to attend any meetings since that time. They've also stopped responding to draft proposals for joint prayers. So then on top of that, now the current Yoon Suk-yeol presidential administration has declared that peace organizations, people doing peace movement projects, are anti-state organizations. And so they've completely stopped approving NCCK applications for exchanges and communication with North Koreans, with the KCF. So even though that communication has only been one way since 2019, the South Korean Unification Ministry still calls the NCCK, when they've written the sort of proposed draft joint prayer, like this last couple of years, Unification Ministry calls and says, "You have just violated the Inter-Korean exchange law and you're under investigation and will be on notice if you do this again," kind of thing. So the South Korean government is really refusing to accept those applications and putting a lot of pressure on groups like the NCCK. So in the meantime, the NCCK tries its best to work on advocacy to South Korea, to the US, and to the UN to end the state of war, encouraging church partners around the world to try to communicate with the KCF. So other Christians in other countries who have those communications, like say maybe other groups who have communications to PUST, the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology. So these groups, the ACT Alliance and the CCA, the Christian Conference of Asia, trying to see if they're receiving, and some of them are receiving responses and receiving emails from KCF still this year, thankfully. Then my wife and I, my family, this is what we look like now. That was you saw the old picture. My son is a little bit bigger. He also has long hair like me now. We're getting along as well as we can. My wife is still Haeyoung is still the site coordinator for the YAV program here in Korea. We have one YAV who's living here now. I continue trying to interpret the work of the NCCK to partners around the world. And now I'm working on a dissertation, a PhD through Trinity College, on how these encounters can be founded on a just peace that then transform the way those meetings are had, and especially transform the perceptions, transform hearts and minds of U.S. Americans, as a U.S. American myself. So it's been a pleasure. I really appreciate being able to share these stories of transformation, of things that Christians are doing in the muck, in the middle of a conflict. So I know Charles also has some to share because he was there at Arnoldshine in 2008, right?
Yep. Thank you so very much, Kurt. Your picture sort of gave me memory lane. 1986, that Gleon picture.
Oh, that one, yeah.
Yeah, that's when I began my ministry at my current church. Of course, I came back, the English language ministry in New York. And
New York.
you see Michael Ham in the last row. And of course, he was part of that network and was excited. I mean, one of the first ones to hear about what happened in Leon, and then inviting him to my pulpit to preach on that experience and what it means to do that. And when you go to Arnold Schein picture when EFK was launched, I'm not in that picture. There were some other pictures I might be in, but not this official one because I was not a delegate. I was a translator. So I spent 4 days in the translation box, simultaneous translation, Korean, English, German, three-way translations. So that's where I was and met all of them. Especially, I spent whole day with North Korean delegates, giving them tours on Rosenmontag. Monday before. They have what like in Germany, the carnival happens on Monday, and I took them to Mainz, and it was such an incredible experience to show them what it was like. So one question before, as a moderator, I have the privilege to ask you a question first before Reverend Sugiro Song will glean the questions and raise them. It began with the mistrust. It had some incredible moments of hopes and some specific concrete impacts, no question. Yet at this time, we are in some of the darkest phase of this Tozanso process as we celebrate 40th. Out of that experience that you have observed, you have studied, what would be one recommendation, one sort of advice or I don't know, a wisdom you could offer to all those peacemakers, especially faith-based peacemakers here, in light of what is happening now and like almost impossible tasks because of the global US and Korea situation is so dire.
Yeah, I mean, so this hasn't been the first time that there's been sort of a freeze, that they haven't been able to have meetings. There's been a number of other times throughout the process. Like, for example, when there was the sinking of the Cheonan, because South Korea Navy had fired on a North Korean fishing ship, and then North Korea responded by the sinking of the submarine, the Cheonan, and then that was threatening to blow up into a war. At that time, also the NCCK and KCF had to cut off their meetings, and so there was this pause for a while. But in that time, so while they were waiting to be able to meet again, they were like, okay, well, let's just try to communicate in whatever way we can. But at that time, they were still able to communicate, so they were still able to write prayers. And they, for example, they released a joint statement together saying, hey, we all need to pull back from war right now. We can't keep doing tit for tat kind of thing. Now it's a little different because there's not even communication. So there's a little bit more concern in this pause, but for example, the NCCK is still saying this is still just a pause. This isn't fundamentally isn't going to be that much different. That in a couple of years, as the political atmosphere changes, the opportunities will open up again. So in the meantime, we prepare for those opportunities. So that's why they're reaching out to other sort of partners to get the WCC in Geneva to open up communication lines, and CCA in Thailand to open up communication lines. But another thing that came out of the 100th anniversary conference was, for example, we heard from one sort of secular organization, peace group, from the Korea sharing movement, and they talked about maybe we need to turn back to ourselves now and work on our society, like in South Korea, and change these enemy images that have developed that keep people stuck in saying we cannot possibly meet them, we can't talk to them, they're so evil that dialogue can't possibly work. We need to work on deconstructing those and transforming those. And so that's, for me, is kind of what I think like is what can be our role as peacemakers. What can you be doing to address all the enemy images that you hear shared in conversations in the US? The way that the US media portrays North Korea as thugs, you know, the same language they use for Black Lives Matter protesters, the same language they've used for civil rights things, the way they use that racialized language on North Korea. So try to work on that, rehumanizing that. And I think it's a little bit like preparing the soil in the meantime, getting the US ready, getting political will ready for when it opens up again, when the policies change and the window opens up again, that we're ready to be an integral part of those agreements and the dialogue moving forward, as opposed to being a stumbling block, which is what we became in 2018 during the Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un peace process. We went in there and became a stumbling block because we weren't ready. The US isn't ready. They're still stuck in enemy image mode. So what are we doing to prepare the soil? That's kind of what I'm imagining.
Thank you so very much, Kurt. I'm going to ask Reverend Song, Silgiro Song, to begin fielding the questions.
Yeah, the first question that we have is from Debbie Blaine, and are the churches still standing in North Korea?
Yes, with like for example, the CCA, they attended this 100th year anniversary. They've said that they still hear from the Korean Christian Federation. There's a change in staff. For example, the woman who is working on the email communications, they've moved to another person, and so another person is now handling the communications. But they've talked about they still worship in their churches. They didn't stop being Christians just because we stopped meeting, right? They're not actually actors. They're actually Christians. They worship. They go to church and they read from scripture and they pray. So all of that has continued on even now today.
Thank you. The next question we have is, what has the involvement or influence or lack thereof of the Roman Catholic Church in Korea, US, and Germany looked like in these processes? And has Pax Christi International been an active part of the efforts of reconciliation and reunification in the Korean Peninsula?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Because there has been, for example, communication between the NCCK and the Catholic Church here in Korea, but they don't do a lot of like joint projects like these days. When there was democratization was going on, the Roman Catholic Church was in many cases standing out front and leading even more than the NCCK was in some instances. So they were heavily involved in that, but they haven't had as much active involvement in these like meetings with North Koreans. I was in what was it, in 2022 there was a forum held by the Catholic Church in Washington D.C. and they invited me to come and sort of talk a little bit about what the Protestants are doing with the EFK. And I heard them talk about they had been having communication with the Catholic Federation of Catholics in Korea, which was the Catholic Christian Federation, which is separate from the Korean Christian Federation. But they had met them and they had done some trips in there, but they didn't have an ongoing process like the Protestants have. So they were talking about, okay, what do we need to do to create that kind of process? So I know they're having that kind of conversation. We have also reached out to some chapters of Pax Christi and to try to bring them to participate in EFK meetings. And there's a Father Kang Jusok, Peter Kang, I think, who's working in the office of, I think, justice or also reconciliation, reunification in the Korean Catholic Church. And so we're inviting him to sort of EFK meetings and trying to keep him involved in our conversations. But at the moment, the Catholic Protestant conversation is tricky. And that's also in part because there's the Catholic Protestant conflict that the missionaries brought is still very much alive in the Korean Christian community, unfortunately. But there is work to overcome that also.
Let's see. And the next question again is from Jessica Sun from Pax Christi. What caused this current pause of communication between NCCK and KCF? Apologies if I missed the explanation on this earlier.
Right. I mean, the cause is hard to be super clear about. What I can say is our last meeting was held in December of 2019. So at that time we met in Shenyang, China, and that was after the Hanoi summit had happened. And that was interesting because after the Hanoi summit, and even there was another Oslo summit where it was like, okay, well, let's try like one more time, we'll present something, and it was just like, no, your demands are too strict, too strong, and so the political process had become completely shut down by then, and so the Moon Jae-in government was having no communicate. They were not receiving any responses. But the KCF was able to continue meeting with us. So we met them in China. And then the Moon Jae-in government came in and said, what is you hearing? What are they saying about what the North Korean leadership is wanting, is looking for? Because you're the only ones who are getting to meet your North Korean counterparts right now. So like at that, other channels were beginning to be shut down, and that was because of the breakdown in negotiations. But then the coronavirus pandemic happened, and we can say that was a huge cause of North Korea completely shutting its borders, saying we have to protect ourselves because our healthcare system won't be able to handle such a massive pandemic. So they completely cut off all communication and cut off travel and movement across the border. And so that also led to cut the cutoff of communication with the NCCK. So it was sort of all of those things happening around the same time, 2019 and then early 2020.
Austin asks, you mentioned under the Yoon administration, the Ministry of Unification has been pressuring NCCK to stop contacting partners in the North. Could you explain a bit more about how NCCK navigates this pressure? Have they stopped sending emails, or have they simply ignored MOU? Could MOU take legal action against NCCK?
Yeah, I mean, maybe in this public forum, I can't say all the specific details, but NCCK, in one sense, just continues doing it, writing its prayers and taking the phone calls, and saying, we're gonna fight these investigations. And when one thing that NCCK has begun doing is before, like under Moon Jae-in, the NCCK could have its communication, write the prayers, have the meetings, and then send a report afterward to the Ministry of Unification. So now the NCCK sees that Yoon Suk-yeol is trying to block a lot of these things. So it's like, okay, instead of just before writing the report, we'll send our application in before. But the Yoon Suk-yeol government just refuses to refuses to accept the application, or just denies the application. Right. And so the NCCK says, well, we'll at least do what we can. We'll write the prayer, even though the government is going to get angry at us. But that's similar to how the NCCK has responded even before. So, for example, in the Park Geun-hye administration, after the sinking of the Cheonan and everything, when they did finally set up another meeting with the KCF, it wasn't an EFK meeting. It was just NCCK having a brief meeting with the KCF in China. And they came back, and the Unification Ministry said, you broke the law, national security law, Inter-Korean Exchange Act, and so you're being fined. And so at that time, the Unification Ministry fined every individual from NCCK several $1,000s for participating in that meeting. And the NCCK said, right, we're just going to keep fighting it, and we're going to keep sending emails and keep meeting at that time. But so that's the same sort of mindset that NCCK is carrying on. Yeah.
Sung-an Kim asks, since no more news stories are coming out from exchanges with DPRK partners, what is your strategy for engaging with your audience in the US?
Right. One of the things that came out of the 100th anniversary conference was we had a lot of staff from our US partners present at that time. So we had a quick meeting to talk about what it would take to revive this Korean North American working group that the NCCK had been working on with ecumenical partners. So unfortunately, the important people that we didn't have present at the conference was the NCCC USA staff. They were unable to attend. So those gathered there. We did have some people from US and from US denominations who were serving on the board for the NCCC USA. So they were able to say what we can do is make a proposal to the NCCC USA that we take back lead initiation of this Korea North American working group, and also reach out to Canadian partners to bring them back into that, and then start working on how that working group can be planning for a possible next visit by the NCCK and possibly World Council of Churches to Washington, D.C. again to meet with whatever presidential administration is going to take office in this next year. So, possibly next fall, after that new administration has got its footing, then our U.S. partners are talking about what that could look like to set up meetings with them through the NCC USA and the Korean North America Working Group. And then also in the meantime, it's me. What I'm doing is having webinars like this and connecting to U.S. congregations that are supporting us, sharing the stories and humanizing the conflict.
One more question.
One more question. How is the NCCK dealing with the issues on human rights and religious liberty in North Korea in relationship with the KCF? Apart from the NCCK as an ecumenical body, the conservative groups such as the Christian Council of Korea have continued in defending human rights and religious liberty, which often resulted in conflicts in the North Korean government as well as the KCF.
Right. So one of the things that NCCK will say is, like, for example, I shared the story of when someone decided they wanted to start condemning the North Korea only for human rights violations. And then that led to some trouble, and the NCCK and WCC had to work to bring back perspective to all the partners and to the Taiwan church. And part of that perspective is how the NCCK talks about what it's like to deal with human rights in the Korean context. And the point that they make is, well, the first, like, one of my staff, I remember what he said when I had US partners visiting. He said, right now we need to make peace. That peace comes, and peace provides the environment where human rights can be protected. So long as there is a state of war, it is too easy for anyone, and that includes, this is why this was the realization of the NCCK and the German church, that so long as there's a state of war, there won't be actual democracy or human rights, both in North Korea or in South Korea. So human rights are still threatened in South Korea also. So because we're at war, like, we're working on making peace with our enemies. When we have become friends, when we're friends with North Korea, then we can talk about human rights. That makes sense. But so long as we're at war, so long as we're threatening the very state, the existence of North Korea, there's no use. There's nothing to say about human rights. The other part of it, for me as a U.S. American, what was important for me to learn was that U.S. and South Korea had been engaging in human rights violations since the beginning. So especially the U.S. and going in 1945, the government that we created was basically fascist. It was the fascist Koreans who had been a part of the Japanese colonial government that we put in power of the new South Korean government. for at all stages, both in the like National Assembly, in the Advisory Council, and all of the Koreans who worked for the fascist Japanese colonial police then became the South Korean police force and immediately started engaging in human rights violations. And then the birth of the South Korean government in 1948, also the first action was sending the military to Jeju to commit a massacre before the Korean War even started. So both, we're talking massive human rights violations, maybe, you know, South Korea even starting the human rights violations. And then going on. And while the military dictatorship in South Korea was continuing human rights violations, massacres in Gwangju and all, and torturing people, even during that, they were condemning, and these Christian groups, these churches who are part of the CCK, while South Korea was committing massive human rights violations, were condemning North Korea, say your human rights violations prove that you're evil and are invalid, while ignoring their own South Korean human rights violations. So there's an extreme kind of hypocrisy about those kind of one-way condemnations. And for me, like as a Christian, it's the log in my own eye, right? I mean, and that's what NCCK will also turn back to sometimes. Is like, we, as Christians, we need to check out the log in our own eye, and it's only going to make things worse. It's only going to deepen war and deepen conflict and deepen dehumanization if we talk about, if we only are condemning one way and we don't recognize. And for me, it's recognizing the nature of the system that is in place right now, which is the US having command authority over South Korean military, and the South Korean government, the current administration, saying that our alliance to the US is more important than peace. Those kind of things are what drive the continue the enmity, continuing the ongoing war, and continue allowing leadership on both sides to say human rights take a backseat to our own victory in this conflict, that we need to achieve victory, and that's more important than human rights, more important than justice. So first, let's get to peace, or at least in the state of war, and start peace building. And that will be the atmosphere that we can create to address human rights violations, both in South Korea and in North Korea. You know, so that's the step we need to take now.
Thank you so very much, Kurt, and thank you, Reverend Silgiro Song, for fielding the questions. We'll have some announcements to make, and maybe some PR for our program and future programming. But we will hold this Zoom as long as there's one last person to stay, so we could have a post-formal ending conversation if you so choose to. I'm going to invite Reverend Douglas Asbury to give us some actionable, after all this, what are some specific things we can do that KPN, Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network, has been working on. Would you please?
Sure, yeah. Of course, some of you, I'm sure, have been involved in the and what have become the annual efforts to persuade Congress people, our congressional representatives, to support legislation that has been before Congress now for maybe 6 or 8 years. Every 2 years it has to be reintroduced in the House of Representatives. But right now, it's Bill H.R. 1369, and it's titled the Peace on the Korea Peninsula Act, the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. And basically, it's just calling on the president to urge the Secretary of State to begin negotiating with South Korea and North Korea to sign a peace treaty, develop and sign a peace treaty to end the Korean War. I was in Washington, D.C., and attended a George Washington University seminar in which we heard panel discussions, and we heard discussions of what was necessary to end the Korean War. And there were 2 military officers. One had been, I think, in the command of the Pacific Fleet for a time, and another was an officer in another area of the service. And they differed on a lot of things about policy, but they agreed that a peace treaty needed to be signed between North and South Korea and the United States, and perhaps China also, for any progress to be made in terms of ending the tension on the Korean Peninsula. And both of them said, if a peace treaty is never signed, peace will never come to the Korean Peninsula. So the peace treaty is a first step in making any further progress toward peace. So if you haven't done so already, or even if you have done so, you can repeat it. Contact your representative in the House, and of course, in January, that will be somebody new. And probably the bill will be reintroduced under a different number in January or early next year. But impress upon them the need to have a peace treaty to end the Korean War. It's been going on since the armistice of 1953, and that means it's 71 years that we've had an armistice, a ceasefire, without a peace treaty. And it's time we had a peace treaty so that we can make some progress. A part of the challenge, though, is that while Donald Trump wrote love letters to Kim Jong-un, supposedly, and Kim Jong-un responded very positively, and they had a very good meeting at Singapore, when they came to Hanoi, Trump showed his true colors, and he said to Kim Jong-un, you have to denuclearize, otherwise we don't have anything to talk about. And of course, Kim Jong-un, who thought he was going to make some progress with a more positive relationship with the US president, was taken aback by that and blindsided, and he walked out of the meeting. And a lot of us in the West said, well, Kim Jong-un just doesn't want peace. But the reality is he wants to maintain his own position as the leader of North Korea, while also making progress toward peace in a more give and take fashion. And Trump wasn't to allow that. And unfortunately, President Biden has pretty much continued the same kind of hard line against Kim Jong-un. And that wasn't helped by the end of President Moon's tenure as president and the election of President Yoon, who's a much more of a hawk in terms of North Korea. So we need to have some progress on the political front. But as Kurt was talking about, and as it's been revealed in our discussions, we need also a concomitant progress on the religious front. Some years ago, when I first became involved in the Korea peace process, I chronicled and got the contact information for all of the Korean pastors in the Northern Ola Conference of the United Methodist Church, within which I'm a retired pastor now. And I wrote them all an email, and I said, I'm involved with the Korea Peace Now movement. We're trying to bring peace on the Korean Peninsula. As Christians, we're called to forgive our enemies, to love our enemies, to love our neighbor as ourselves. And I believe the Korea Peace Now movement is...
So, Doug, can you wrap it up? Because we have a little more announcements. Yes, thank you.
Right, consistent with that effort. And therefore, I think we should cooperate on encouraging our congregations and Christians in the United States, especially Korean American Christians, to advocate for the end of the Korean War and making peace with Korea. I got one positive response from one couple who were pastors, and the others either didn't answer at all or gave negative responses, which testifies to the fact of the early evangelization of the Korean Peninsula that has set up the idea that communism is evil and capitalism is good, and therefore we can never compromise with communism. So the political has imposed itself on the religious, and the religious has basically cooperated with the political in resisting peace on the Korean Peninsula. So we need to work within our churches as well as working within our national government.
Thank you so very much, Doug. So on your chat, Reverend Sugiro Song had a link on how to end the travel ban to North Korea. There's a concurrent effort in addition to 1369 that we are able to go to North Korea to do this work. Also, there is Korea Advocacy Week that KPN does regularly. So you're all on our mailing list. Stay involved. And from now on, looking forward to this joint prayer, hopefully soon with North Korean Christians and South Koreans together. But as of now, for the last couple of years, has been only NCCK version that WCC published. We will also send it out and use that prayer for your spiritual and peace work, both political and religious work simultaneously. One other announcement is that the faith-based community, the caucus meets once a month at this time, last Thursday of the month. 1 month is among ourselves discussing topics and sharing our thoughts. And another month is this kind of formal webinar, inviting an expert. November, last Sunday, it's sort of Thanksgiving and then Advent. So we combined the two. On the first Thursday of December, which if I open my calendar, would be December 5th. At same time, 8 p.m. Eastern time, we will offer another webinar that day. We are still deciding which webinar, something like today's, always different topics, faith-based, but related to Korea peacemaking. So keep that in mind. That's what we have today. And thank you very much for coming. We could possibly end our formal part, maybe stop recording, and we'll simply hold this space for further conversation.